Hail Kingdom! It's me, Spazza King, and today we're going into World of Elder Scrolls Oblivion Remastered. We're going to break all syncable and unsyncable speed limits. So, kings and queens, meet our today's protagonist, our blue-skinned Arnesia Argonian, or how I call him, Argonic. Anyway, we're going to start game pretty fast, since that's what we're doing here today. We're basically going fast through Oblivion, yeah, since Argonic comes with really high agility and speed from the get-go. And I guess it's self-explanatory that we're going for the Thief burst sign to get more agility, speed and luck. And definitely we're making custom class with speed and luck as favorite attributes, and we're going full Argonic today, yeah, athletics, acrobatics, we just want to increase the skills more rapidly, that's our main idea. But
fast food has never been good food, but it was a quick, easy, reliable, and cheap way to get a meal that appealed to people who were time poor or just, well, you know, actually poor. Mass layoffs, increasing economic uncertainty, deferred student loan payments kicking in, and spiking levels of consumer debt should be the perfect opportunity for these cheap offerings to bring in customers who don't have much money to spare, but still want to eat. For a long time, companies like McDonald's, Domino's, KFC, Taco Bell, and Wendy's were considered recession-proof, because even in the most dire of circumstances, people still need to eat, and the companies typically offered the best exchange rate of dollars to calories in the market. But that's changed. In a business move that can only be described as confusing, these brands have responded to cost-conscious, busy, and desperate consumers by becoming more expensive, slower, and less reliable. Unsurprisingly, sales across the industry have plummeted at a time when they should be outperforming. It would almost be comical if they weren't collectively some of the largest employers in the country. However, the mid-recession has been caused by more than some management missteps. It's a clear sign of some much bigger problems in the wider economy.
You know, it's supposed to be cheap, quick, and an easy option.
I personally stopped eating out at fast food for me because it got so expensive it wasn't worth the money.
McDonald's posted its biggest US sales decline in nearly 5 years.
I buy the mac chicken sandwich. It's $3, almost $4.
It's also hitting what traditionally had become the cheaper option. But for many, that's no longer the case.
Endless possibilities.
Okay, so before we get into the fast food industry as the canary in the coal mine for much larger structural economic problems, there is something more important we need to understand. Fast food locations used to be fun. Pizza Huts looked like actual huts. Chuck E. Cheese had rodent-themed decor, and McDonald's was full of bright colors, escaped convicts, and nightmare-inducing clowns. That's clearly changed, and now almost any fast food store you go into is the same generic style of nondescript, boxy modern commercial building. This has happened for a few reasons that are each very revealing about the broader direction the industry has gone. The first reason is that children have become less important to overall business demands. In the good old days, companies would advertise directly to children in the hopes they would effectively become little sales representatives and throw a shit fit until their parents gave in and took them to get some deep-fried slop. Regulations around advertising to children and a general cultural shift away from feeding children too much unhealthy food means that companies can't rely on this market as much anymore though. According to a YouGov survey, Americans between the ages of 18 and 34 are now the largest consumers of fast food, with 42% reporting the consumer set a week. Demographic shifts means this age group is now less likely to have children of their own, so the extra money and maintenance on custom storefronts isn't worth it since a ball pit is unlikely to appeal to most 20-somethings. No shame though. Shifting consumer trends are one thing, but the bigger reason is that restaurant locations have become far less important and much more interchangeable. According to market data from the consulting firm McKinsey & Company, people are now almost twice as likely to order food through a delivery service like Uber Eats or DoorDash than they are to physically sit in a fast food restaurant and eat their meal. Fast food locations are increasingly just becoming distribution centers for Postmate drivers, so maybe we shouldn't be surprised that they have started looking like Amazon warehouses. Anyway, alongside ingredients and staffing, the real estate these restaurants sit atop is simultaneously the largest expense in most locations as well as being a significant asset. As the story goes, Ray Kroc, the man responsible for scaling McDonald's into a global fast food empire, figured out that he wasn't in the burger business. He was in the real estate business. To this day, for the majority of fast food locations, most of the money is made by the commercial real estate. The restaurant that sits on the land is basically just a tenant producing cash flows. It doesn't matter if the tenant is a Wendy's or a McDonald's. So stores have become more uniform to lower the cost of construction and the risk of having an unusual building that nobody else wants to rent if a franchise moves out. So if you want to know why fast food restaurants look so boring these days, you can blame real estate speculation, shifting socioeconomics, and middleman technology, something of a recurring theme on this channel. Now anyway, this whole game only works if these businesses still bring in cash, and to do that they need to move some hamburgers. The trouble is, that's getting really hard. Fast food prices have increased significantly beyond inflation. According to data collected from Finance Buzz, the average McDonald's menu item is now twice as expensive as it was 10 years ago. This trend is partially because fast food items used to be artificially cheaper than they should have been. When people would order in-store, there was more opportunity to upsell them to larger meal sizes and tack on higher margin extras like desserts and drinks, so they could make their staple menu items cheaper to attract customers. Now, ingredients and rent has become more expensive, and on top of that, restaurants need to give a significant portion of their top-line revenue to delivery companies. To maintain their margins, they had to raise prices, and their pivot to more premium branding was a way to justify this change without acknowledging that getting food hand delivered is a luxury with inherent increased costs. Fast food companies aren't allowed to directly offer lower prices in their stores than they do via delivery apps, even though they don't have the additional expenses. So they have had to become sneaky and offer various meal deals so that restaurant customers can get better deals if they are willing to navigate through deals via their own apps and check out in-store meal combinations. If you are a savvy Mick connoisseur and you are willing to sit down, do the math, and make the most of various deals on the company-run fast food apps and in-store offers, you can end up paying half as much for the same food as someone who just turned their brain off and poked at the cheeseburger pictures they wanted on their delivery app of choice. This has made shopping for fast food increasingly confusing and time-consuming, which is exactly the opposite reason why customers go to these companies in the first place. Now, the companies are not exactly blameless victims in this trend. Bloated and confusing menus and premium offerings had the potential to extract the most possible money out of the widest spectrum of customers, from the rich and lazy to the poor and savvy. But now, the market has turned against them, and this clever little business model could be their undoing. So it's time to learn how many works to find out if fast food companies have cooked themselves.
I know why I armor up every day.
This week's video is sponsored by Storyblocks. If you've ever had to piece together stock footage clip by clip, you know how fast those costs can add up, and how frustrating it is to track down exactly what you need. Storyblocks takes that stress out of the process by offering unlimited downloads of high-quality stock video, music, sound effects, templates, and more, all for one predictable subscription price. We've used it for everything, from last-minute B-roll to motion graphics to save us hours in post. Having everything in one place just makes our workflow faster and lets us stay focused on the creative. Plus, all of the content is royalty-free with clear-cut licensing, so we never have to worry about copyright claims or surprises later on. If you're a creator looking to level up your production without blowing your budget, Storyblocks is seriously a game changer. To get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head over to storyblocks.com/works or click the link in the description. So it's not all bad news. As Q1 earnings have been revealed, some brands have actually increased their sales. Taco Bell, which is owned by the conglomerate Young Brands, increased average store sales by 9% compared to last year. This success has been attributed almost exclusively to the company's Lux Box sets, which have become what fast food used to be: a large quantity of food with a lot of calories for not very much money. Even though the industry declined overall, Taco Bell grew because it attracted customers priced out of other options. The company's own CEO boasted on the earnings call that the company's performance was thanks to massive wins with low-income consumers. Young Brands, which also owns chains like KFC and Pizza Hut, does not invest heavily into real estate like McDonald's, and instead rents most of their locations from third-party commercial landlords. This means that when picking a location to open a store, they don't have to worry about the underlying fundamentals of the area and the real estate market. They can focus exclusively on what locations are going to bring in the most foot traffic. This also lets brands operate in locations that would otherwise be considered undesirable by real estate investors with a side hustle in burgers. Across the rest of the industry, though, fast food as a whole has largely lost ground to people just choosing to cook from home. I know this isn't exactly groundbreaking news to be watching, but food has become kind of expensive. The key demographics of young workers that consume fast food are the same people who are getting laid off first, and statistically have less savings to get them through periods of reduced income. These people also, on average, have more debt to manage outside of a residential mortgage. By now, you have probably seen the memes about being able to split your burrito purchase into 4 easy installments using Klarna through DoorDash. Now, this has probably been blown out of proportion, as Klarna is just a payment processor that a lot of people are more comfortable with over a credit card or a bank transfer. But it's a humorous way to acknowledge the more serious issue that people are going into debt just to keep up, and new platforms like this are making it easier than ever to do. Klarna and similar services now represent an extra $700 billion worth of consumer debt that isn't being officially recorded, on top of over $1 trillion in credit card debt and student debt, which people now actually need to pay again. So people are short on cash, but these companies are also losing another group of consumers. Fast food has typically been popular with people who just didn't have that much time after working a long shift and then spending an hour or more commuting. But even that has become less of a selling point. Fast food is not that fast anymore. Average wait times have increased significantly, which means unless you are willing to pay the premium to get food delivered, it's almost faster to cook some basic food for yourself. Now, fast food getting slower has happened for 2 reasons. The first is that larger menus make it harder to prepare food in advance and keep it ready to be instantly handed over. Now, this also means that food is prepared to order, which is nice, apart from the second reason. Fast food turnover is higher than it's ever been, and overall staff care is low because people simply do not value these jobs as much as they once did. Now, expecting people to go above and beyond for a minimum wage job at a fast food franchise is clearly a bit dumb. But it's getting harder to find people that want to do the job at all. Once again, fast food companies have kind of been outmaneuvered by the delivery apps. Minimum wage workers now have more options, and delivering food and answering to an algorithm is more attractive to a lot of people than cooking food and answering to the power-tripping shift manager. Of course, the obvious solution is to just pay people more, and some companies are basically being forced to do that. But then they either need to raise their prices even further or cut into already razor-thin margins. These companies are investing a lot of money into automated kitchens to cut down on staff before they get too much negotiating power. But that technology is still in its infancy, and these brands have shareholders to answer to now. If they raise prices anymore, they will also be competing directly with slightly more upmarket fast casual dining, and even local independent restaurants, which are getting harder to differentiate from. Longer wait times and a slightly more expensive menu is expected at these stores. For people who want convenience and are willing to pay a few extra dollars for it, they can just order from these more upmarket restaurants off the apps as well. People who aren't worried about paying a $5 delivery fee and 20% delivery tip also aren't going to think twice about paying a few extra dollars to get chef-prepared food over a barely assembled McChicken. For everybody else, the struggles of the cheapest restaurant is a sign of a pretty bleak financial reality. Most of the CEOs that presented poor earnings for this quarter acknowledged tough economic times for people choosing to eat takeaway less, including that cooking from home has become much more popular for people looking to make their money go further. Now, individually, this is a fantastic trend. Unless you are an extremely high-income earner or working an equally extreme schedule, cooking for yourself is one of the best things you can do to improve your health and personal finances. So, if you can do it, you probably should do it. But for society at large, when fast food becomes a luxury, that should raise a few alarm bells. Grocery store food has also become much more expensive, and more people than ever now work multiple full-time jobs, so finding the time amongst that schedule to also prepare food is hard. That's also ignoring that according to US Census data, around 9% of households below the federal poverty level don't have an adequately functioning kitchen at all. Yes, a lot of people are choosing to cook from home instead of ordering some Kentucky Fried carbs, and that's good, but a lot of people are just skipping meals altogether, and that's bad. A survey conducted by Credit Karma found that more than a quarter of respondents admitted to skipping meals because of rising grocery costs. This survey was also conducted on people who are using a credit score tracking service, so the population sample is probably doing better than the current average. Now, this has the potential to cause a feedback loop in low-income communities, because fast food is one of the country's largest employers. Outside of Walmart, Yum Brands and McDonald's are the second and third largest employers of American workers. They may not be the most desirable jobs in the world, but they provide some income to millions of people. If restaurants start closing down, that could quickly become a huge unemployment problem amongst people with the least financial security to begin with. Now, the story is not much better for these companies outside of America either. Most people around the world are struggling with the same financial realities of increased living costs and economic uncertainty. On top of that, America isn't exactly the most popular kid on the block at the moment. Brands like McDonald's, KFC, and Starbucks are struggling with a general anti-American sentiment across most of their markets as people are choosing to support their local chains over the unashamedly American businesses. According to McDonald's own market survey, they found an increase in people in various markets saying they're going to be cutting back on purchases of American brands. Now, companies delivering poor financial news to their shareholders always comes armed with some excuses, but this is clearly a major shift in consumer behavior right when they come least afford it. Now, there is a growing group of consumers that unfortunately fast food isn't particularly good at taking advantage of. Go and watch this video next to find out how some Americans got so good at buying food. And make sure to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.
You need to teach me that skill, Stephen.
Business decisions made in the interest of maximizing shareholder value have caused mass layoffs, environmental catastrophes, an endless list of corporate frauds, and record inequality in the workplace. The very same CEO who made millions of dollars by being the first champion of maximizing shareholder value in the 60s called it the dumbest idea in the world, and something that could rot capitalism to its core. But worst of all, maximizing shareholder value isn't even good for the shareholders.
Managers, CEOs that find mutual duty to their shareholders to be concerned only with the bottom line. We think this is wrong.
To continue to create the capacity to be able to reward our shareholders as we have done in 2023 and as we hope to continue to do in 2024.
They sparking a debate about the purpose of a corporation and why maximizing shareholder returns
If you hate your job, here is a history lesson for you that might make it start to make sense. In 1916, the Ford Motor Company had revolutionized the automobile industry with the Ford Model T. Henry Ford, the founder and majority stockholder of the company, wanted to use the surplus cash they had accumulated to build additional plants and hire even more workers to build even more cars. Ford had also famously and controversially raised factory worker wages significantly and offered benefits like the 40-hour work week. In press interviews, Ford spoke about his plans for the company. My ambition is to employ still more men, to spread the benefits of the industrial system to the greatest possible number, to help them build up their lives and their homes. To do this, we are putting the greatest share of our profits back into the business. This angered minority shareholders in the company that just wanted him to lower wages again, raise the price of the Model T, and keep paying them a regular dividend. Since Ford was the majority shareholder in the company, though, their options were limited. So they took him to court. But the court sided with the minority shareholders. Ford was forced to consider the best interests of shareholders above his other business ambitions. This was the case that set the precedent for shareholder primacy in America, meaning the board of directors and executives in a company must always try to maximize shareholder value to the best of their ability. Some have mistaken this ruling to mean that CEOs and the boards that appoint them have a legal mandate to maximize shareholder value, but the reality is that this simply isn't true. The case was awarded in favor of the minority shareholders, but it upheld the business judgment rule, which means that executives can do what they believe is in the best interest of the company, even if it doesn't make the number on a stock chart go up. Ford himself wasn't paying his workers more and making new jobs because he wanted to be nice. He was a ruthless businessman who wanted to control a larger share of the growing automobile market. By paying his workers better and offering them higher wages, he was just denying his competitors a workforce. And by pricing his Model Ts just above cost, he made it almost impossible for any other manufacturer to sell a profitable budget automobile. The biggest irony of all of this is the minority shareholders that took Ford to court were John and Horace Dodge. They owned about 10% of the company and used their special dividends to fund growth of their own company, Dodge, a car maker that would eventually become one of Ford Motors' biggest rivals. So this court ruling was bad for the company's leaders, bad for workers, bad for the country, and bad for the shareholders in Ford who sacrificed market dominance for a quick payday. But there are 3 reasons why people still believe in maximizing shareholder value, and 3 reasons why companies that operate this way are almost guaranteed to fail. So it's time to learn how money works to find out how the worst idea in business history became the new normal for corporate America. This week's lesson is sponsored by Delete Me. Did you know that your personal data is sold online by data brokers? You have the right to your privacy and to protect your personal data. When data brokers sell your data, it puts you at risk, including the risk of identity theft and being stalked. Delete Me helps you keep your personal info private. I personally use Delete Me, and it's pulled my information away from a variety of data brokers. And the process is easy. It's a hands-free subscription service that removes your personal information that's being sold online, including your phone number and home address. Simply submit your info, let the experts find it, and get it removed from the internet. And afterwards, it monitors sites and repeats removal as needed. all on autopilot during the length of your subscription. Get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/HMW and use promo code HMW at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/HMW, code HMW. Corporate America didn't always have the dangerous obsession with shareholder value that it does today. And even after the landmark Dodge versus Ford case in 1919, companies were slow to change. Between the mid-1960s and 1970s, American stock markets traded mostly sideways. Corporate CEOs still had a duty to do what was best for the company, but they were paid a normal salary and a small bonus just like every other normal employee. According to the Economic Policy Institute and the National Bureau of Labor Statistics, CEOs at this time made around 20 times as much as the average employee of their company. So they were still rich, but not so rich that they could retire after one good year. Their motivation was primarily to keep the company running safely so they could maintain their well-paid jobs for as long as possible. By the 1990s, a small group of financiers got the idea that in order to grow to get better returns from their companies, they should align the interests of their CEO with their own interests of getting the stock price as high as possible. They did this by paying the CEOs a smaller cash salary, but added stock options that directly tied CEO bonuses to stock performance. In the 1990s, CEO compensation went from 60 times average worker pay to 380 times average worker pay. My friend Patrick Boyle did a great video on how this small change in corporate norms eventually led to people like Elon Musk demanding $50 billion in compensation for 1 year's work. Now that there was so much money to be made, CEOs and other senior executives were happy to go along with the lie that it was their legal duty to maximize shareholder value, even if it would destroy their companies in the long term. The first strategy they used was picking up pennies in front of a steamroller. It won't surprise you that some of the biggest companies in the world have taken dumb risks. We have seen some of the biggest corporate bankruptcies in history happen in just the past 24 months, and it's becoming more common. If you are a CEO with a multi-million-dollar bonus package on the table, you are going to do everything in your power to tick the boxes you need for the board to grant you that bonus. A top priority for you as the CEO is going to be to increase your company stock price, pay a big dividend, or both. Most bonuses are awarded year to year, and according to Fortune magazine, the average tenure of a Fortune 500 CEO is now only 7 years. For you, big projects that could pay off over decades are effectively useless, unless their announcement could drive up your stock price. But even that's unlikely. Investors rarely care about long-term business strategies because they so rarely come true anyway. Your best strategy is to control bad publicity and focus on next quarter's financials. An easy place to cut expenses is in areas like security, auditing, risk management, safety controls, long-term development, and training. If you cut these enough, you might even increase revenue at the same time, because sales staff and revenue centers can operate more freely without pesky compliance departments making sure things aren't being done illegally. Silicon Valley Bank, one of the largest bank failures in American history, had a risk management department that regulators described as terrible. That's about the harshest thing that financial regulators say about anything. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt because it couldn't say no to the revenue it was making from subprime mortgage bonds. Boeing's repeated string of airline failures has been blamed on a push to get new planes into the air by cutting down on safety controls and testing. HSBC, one of the biggest banks in the world, made billions of dollars in revenue by providing financial services to international criminals. People have lost their jobs, lost savings, and lost their lives in these scandals. But worse than all of that, the shareholders lost billions of dollars from scandals like these and others that are too numerous to list. But the CEOs that ultimately oversaw the companies making these terrible risk trade-offs already made their enormous bonuses, and some of them even got a golden parachute on the way out. Business departments like risk management and cybersecurity have tough jobs. If everything is going well, people question what good they are doing for the business. If things are going badly, people question what good they are doing for the business. You can make a little money by picking up pennies in front of a steamroller, but if something goes wrong, you get smushed all for a few dollars. The short-sighted nature of CEOs mandated to maximize shareholder value is also the second reason it's one of the worst ideas in the history of business. It guarantees that businesses become worse. Jack Welch was the chairman and CEO of General Electric from 1981 to 2001. He worked his way up in the company from an entry-level position, but upon stepping into the top job, he radically reshaped the company in the name of the shareholders. Welch made 72,000 of GE's 400,000 employees redundant. He sold off entire company divisions, and he invested heavily in financial and media arms of the business. GE Capital became the primary focus of an engineering company that made consumer appliances, commercial machinery, and aerospace parts. Welch also pioneered outsourcing and bragged about it on CNBC, a news network he created to focus on business news after GE acquired NBC. His ruthless strategy worked, and during his 20 years as CEO, GE's stock price rose from $6 a share to a high of almost $370 a share a year before being asked to walk away from the company. He did, but not before being awarded an exit package estimated at $417 million. Other CEOs who were now getting paid mainly with stock options saw this maverick CEO talking about his strategies on his own news network, and they figured they couldn't argue with the results. According to data from the Economic Policy Institute, the year that Jack Welch took over as the CEO of General Electric was the last year when increases in worker productivity kept pace with increases in wages. Make of that what you would. Welch's focus on shareholder above every other stakeholder in the business worked well for a long time. But since he was pushed out of the company, the stock price of GE has fallen by roughly 70% from its all-time high, even during a record bull run where the market is up by 400%. GE used to make high-quality products that customers were highly loyal to. GE's outsourcing delivered worse products to the market, leading customers to buy from other brands. GE used to be one of the most attractive companies to work for because they were stable, paid well, and let employees, like Jack Welch himself, work their way up the corporate ladder. GE's CEO proudly boasting about mass layoffs and firing the bottom 10% of staff every year meant it became one of the least desirable companies to work for, so top talent went elsewhere. By sacrificing customers and employees to appease shareholders, they made it worse for them too. Welch himself even said in an interview that maximizing shareholder value was stupid. A high stock price is the result of doing everything else correctly. Why didn't he follow his own advice? Well, because he made too much money by keeping the people that paid him happy. During Welch's tenure as CEO, GE was almost suspiciously good at meeting financial goals. Roger Martin, the dean of the Rotman School of Business at the University of Toronto, said in an interview with Forbes that GE met or beat analyst forecasts in 46 of 48 quarters between December 31st, 1989 and September 30th, 2001. A 96% hit rate. Even more impressive, in 41 of those 46 quarters, GE hit the analyst forecast to the exact penny. 89% perfection. Of course, this wasn't amazing management. It was good old-fashioned creative accounting, a practice that got GE in hot water with the SEC and was part of the reason why Welch was eventually asked to nicely leave the company. Despite his tarnished record, Welch's business practices are still common in a lot of corporate boardrooms across the world. Okay, so you might ask, if encouraging CEOs to pursue short-term gains has shown to be bad for everyone, including the shareholders who appoint the board, who employ the CEO, why are companies still doing this? Well, that's because the third reason why maximizing shareholder value is a terrible idea for everyone. The short term is all that matters. According to data from the largest stock exchanges in America, the average holding period for stocks has been consistently declining for decades. In 1975, investors held onto stocks for an average of 5 years. In 2021, they held onto them for less than 1 year. Electronic brokerages have made buying and selling shares much easier. And people are generally in financial situations that are much less secure where selling shares becomes a way to cover an unexpected expense. That's not how long-term investing should be done. But staying ahead financially these days is hard. The largest dips in shareholder holding periods happened in 2001 and 2008, during down markets and job losses where people were probably selling at a loss on their holdings but needed to cover their expenses one way or another. Long-term capital gains tax laws also encourage people to seek profits from buying and selling year to year rather than a dividend strategy which would be less tax efficient. The result is that if people are holding onto shares for less time, then they also only care about short-term wins. So a CEO that delivers a profitable fourth quarter will be more popular than a CEO who reinvests company earnings into training, R&D, or safety that won't pay off for years. This kind of short-term thinking is not sustainable. But that's another shareholder and CEO's problem. But this isn't the only way. I am going to write an op-ed on business and leadership teams that I have worked with in the real world that are doing things a little bit differently to great success on my totally free email newsletter Competa Daily. For free articles like this, and to get access to these videos a day early, sign up for that in the description below. If you want to see just how bad things can get in the name of shareholder value, go and watch my video on the deadly monetization of nursing homes to find out how this exact business strategy has caused the death of tens of thousands of vulnerable Americans. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on on learning how money works. Global trade has made the USA incredibly rich, but what is good for America isn't always good for Americans. Globalization has let big businesses pull revenue from global markets. It's given consumers cheap products subsidized by poverty wages and investors access to foreign capital from around the world. The best part is, all we had to give up in return was stable, productive jobs that famously defined the American middle class. For some reason, some people have decided this wasn't actually a very good deal, and that workers need a way to regain some of the power they once had. It is genuinely a very reasonable idea that has united people on both sides of the political aisle, which is why it's kind of a shame that we are doing it in the stupidest way possible.
The announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons. Number one is the people that are poured into our country so horribly and so much. Number two are the drugs, fentanyl, and everything else that have come into the country. And number three are the massive subsidies that we're giving to Canada and to Mexico in the form of deficits.
Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods.
Late last week, President Donald Trump formally announced plans to place broad 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and increase tariffs on China by an additional 10%. Despite being one of the central focuses of his campaign, this somehow still came as a shock, because most people really were not expecting such a large change to be enacted so quickly. Just 2 days later, though, an agreement was met with both Canada and Mexico to delay these tariffs in exchange for additional border security assistance. This might seem a bit weird to you, because trade policy and border security are normally two separate issues. But according to the initial White House press release announcing these tariffs, they were actually primarily just a negotiating tactic to get Canada and Mexico to cooperate on these issues. So if military personnel forming on our border is all we wanted, it's mission accomplished. Now, no matter what side of the aisle you fall on, and even if these tariffs weren't explicitly meant to protect American jobs, it has started discussions about who really wins from fighting a trade war. If you have been paying any attention to this whole circus, you probably have been told a dozen times that tariffs are just a tax paid by local businesses on imported goods, which will normally just get passed directly along to the consumer. That means they are really just another invisible tax on average American consumers, and therefore this whole thing is just a bit dumb. Now, that's not wrong. It's true that if these tariffs or some other version of them do eventually go into full effect, you are going to pay more for most products. And therefore this whole thing can just be dismissed as the orange man being reckless with the global economy. But, take alert, there actually is more to this discussion. Even if they don't realize it, anything that both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump can agree on is probably worth looking into a bit more deeply. And if they can resolve three big problems, it could be a step in the right direction for most working Americans, even if it's not done for the right reasons. The first big problem is putting the genie back in the bottle. America's biggest source of imports is now Mexico. A combination of tariffs on China and the investments into production facilities down south has just given them the lead, and they are highly dependent on it. According to the global data firm CEPPII and visuals from the Organization of Economic Complexity, we make up 76% of Mexico's exports, which are now mostly cars, car parts, and basic electronics. According to Glassdoor, Ford Motor Company employees in Mexico City are earning between the equivalent of $10,000 for basic line work and $25,000 a year for highly technical production roles. Combined with less strict environmental, safety, and business regulations, it's hard for a unionized plant in America to compete with that. Now, labor costs are only a small part of the total cost of assembling a car. You also have to add the cost of materials and components, the shipping costs, and the amortized expenses of researching, designing, and tooling for a particular model. So this means even small tariffs could make it cheaper to make big items like cars here in America, which would give American workers more negotiating power over pay and benefits. But it needs more time, or else it's just going to hurt everybody. A lot of our imports from Mexico are components that our workers need to do their jobs. A wiring harness is a bunch of cables that connect all the electronic features in your car together. They are an integral part of assembling modern automobiles, and American factories import almost all of them from Mexico. Without this component, local manufacturers can't make cars. So they are just going to accept the tariff and pass the additional costs along to consumers without actually making any additional jobs. This can also let other cars which are not made in America raise their own prices because their competitors will be forced to do the same thing. The thing is, America can make these wiring harnesses here at home, and doing so will create good union jobs for lots of people. But companies can't build a new factory in 30 days. It takes time. Now, this is just one example of one product, but similar problems are playing out in every important dependent business across the country right now. Big, immediate changes like this don't really help anybody. Now, that's just the first reason, and it's only a small part in the bigger problem that workers, businesses, investors, and trade partners just don't know what the heck is coming next. So it's time to learn how money works to see who is going to win history's dumbest trade war. This week's video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is an interactive learning platform designed to help you truly understand complex topics in math, data science, programming, and even AI. Instead of passive learning, Brilliant's lessons are all about getting hands-on and solving real problems, making learning 6 times more effective than just watching videos. Each course is built by experts from top institutions like MIT and Google, so you know you're learning from the best. Their data science courses, for instance, use real-world datasets from platforms like Airbnb and Spotify, giving you practical insights while you learn. I recently took Brilliant's creative coding course, and it's been a game-changer for building problem-solving skills. It's super interactive, and each lesson builds directly on the last, so you feel your progress as you go. Brilliant's also perfect for fitting learning into your day, whether you're on your computer or just have a few minutes with your phone. Try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/howmoneyworks. And if you like it, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. The idea of winning a trade war really comes down to who is actually going to win. Globalization is an unbelievably complicated issue with thousands of different variables that have all made the world what it is today. The dominance of the US dollar, cultural exchange, digital connectivity, and the end of the Cold War, cross-border intellectual property rights, foreign aid, debt markets, and big international organizations have all shaped our lives. But it's a lot easier to focus on the much more tangible action of global trade, because we can physically see junk get loaded into shipping containers and sailed into our ports. Without accounting for these other variables, though, even the most well-thought-out tariffs in history aren't going to do very much to reverse the winners and losers of globalization. So who are they exactly? Several major economies have been able to develop extremely quickly by focusing on producing exports for the global market, the biggest consumer in that market by far being America. Large multinational companies have also benefited from being able to produce their products more cheaply and sell them in multiple markets across the world. And wealthy asset owners have also won because they got to finance this industrial boom, move their capital freely around the world, and benefit from foreign investors pumping up their existing asset markets. The losers have largely been the groups that weren't as globally mobile. So instead of capitalizing on new global markets, they had to compete with them. Smaller local businesses, and of course above all else, unskilled or semi-skilled workers. You probably already have an idea of the people that have been left behind by globalization. Small town communities in the Rust Belt that don't have as many job opportunities, as major employers went out of business or moved jobs elsewhere. Now, I am going to implement a zero tolerance to Zoomer comments policy. But as someone who grew up in and went to college in Ohio, the expectation was that anybody that completed their degree could immediately move out of the state to one of the big cities that had become part of the global economy rather than just the American economy. Now, obviously, I am now just a worthless influencer, so no major loss there. But by losing other educated young workers, these local areas are falling even further behind. And the big global cities that people need to move to aren't exactly winning out of this either. And if they remain the only places where young workers from across America and the rest of the world can get ahead, then it's going to be incredibly hard to fix it. The reason why a finance bro in New York or a tech worker in California can be paid enough to compensate for these spiraling costs is that they are providing a service that can be leveraged across the global market, whereas a factory worker is producing goods that are competing with the global market. So if we reverse course on this whole free trade business, we should reverse course on the winners and losers, right? Well, no. The strangest group of winners and losers has been the American consumer. One of the reasons why we can get away with being so reckless on trade is that everybody wants what America has, and what America has is consumers. There are a lot of us. Even our basic jobs pay well compared to other countries. And we love to buy shit. It might not feel like it, but a lot of the products you buy are a lot cheaper than they used to be. Easy to transport appliances like fridges, TVs, personal electronics, and computers have all become significantly cheaper over time. Part of this can be explained by advances in technology, but a lot of this is down to big global supply chains that have been hyper-optimized to get consumer junk to your doorstep as cheaply and conveniently as possible. The most extreme incarnation of this process has been online retailers like Wish, Shein, and Temu that directly ship consumer junk that almost seems too cheap to be possible, because a lot of the time, it is. The way that these companies have been able to effectively get these goods into the American market is by taking advantage of a small loophole in our trade policy. The de minimis value exemption lets shipments into the US avoid duties, taxes, and tariffs as long as they are worth less than $800. The intention of the law was to let people mail stuff to friends and family without having to deal with the paperwork and expenses of tariffs typically paid by international businesses. But good intentions didn't stop these companies from building their businesses around taking advantage of this simple carve-out. Normally, imports from big manufacturing nations like China are all shipped together as one big order that is then moved to a warehouse and distributed here by American retailers. But by shipping everything one by one, these companies move their orders under the $800 limit and avoid paying the taxes they really should be. It's much less cost-effective to ship things like this, but the savings on import duties more than make up for it. According to U.S. Customs, they process over 4 million of these packages every single day, with more than half of them originating from China. So it's safe to say this exemption has not really been used as intended. If you don't value your time at all, go to Temu and try to find a product worth more than $800. You probably won't be able to do it, because their business model falls apart if they have to properly compete with retailers like Amazon. Now, this whole game could be considered a win for consumers. If you consider a 2-pack of Bluetooth speakers in the shape of an astronaut for $20 a win. But most consumers can only consume because they are also workers. And for most people, little consumer wins like this are not worth the worker losses they come with. You probably didn't hear as much about it, but in between everything else that was going on, this exemption was also stopped, and a lot of small businesses lost their mind. This was a blow to the Chinese retailers whose whole business model doesn't really work without this loophole, and dropshippers who couldn't get their products in the same way. But for the average American worker, this is a good thing. If slowing down 1 million packages of consumer junk every day is the price we need to pay for more jobs in America, then it's absolutely worth it. The only question is, will it? American companies like Walmart and Amazon will benefit if this rule is upheld. And yeah, obviously they are far from perfect, but they do at least employ more local workers than Temu. Long term, moving in the direction of fair trade rather than totally free trade means we can regain local jobs and capabilities, but it will be a long-term process. One of the most important details that people overlook when arguing for or against trade protection is that most people these days don't actually work in jobs making stuff. Most of our economy is in the service sector, and thanks to communication technologies, things like entry-level administration, customer service, and IT have been outsourced just as fast as the people who make stuff that can be physically shipped across the world. If our definition of winning is getting American jobs back, there are more effective strategies. As I was writing this, the U.S. Postal Service started processing de minimis packages again. And by the time you are watching this, that could have changed, or there could be totally new policies. And that's the final and most serious problem. To win any war, there needs to be a coherent strategy. Businesses right now don't know what is going to happen next, which is making it really hard to react accordingly. If it's made clear which industries are going to be targeted for onshoring, and those industries can provide good jobs, then businesses will either supply them or someone else will. Blanket rules that change day by day means everybody is just going to sit back and wait, which means hiring and investment freezes, which doesn't really help anybody. Now, the bonus problem with this whole situation is that we have become incredibly dependent on just a tiny handful of companies. And no matter which way we have to go from here, they have a plan to make sure they win even if everybody else loses. Go and watch this video on how we let that happen, and make sure to subscribe to keep on learning how money works.
The multiverse offers endless possibilities, but only if it survives this chaos.
Staying on top of all the developments in finance, business, and economics can be exhausting. Between everything becoming an excuse to gamble, corporate consolidation of markets, and political influence driving huge asset bubbles, causing extreme wealth inequality, spiraling consumer debt, and diminishing savings, stagnating wages, unaffordable real estate, and generational wealth divides, all string tied together by questionable government programs, is enough to get pretty depressing. But just remember, it could be worse. We could be Canada. And if that wasn't bad enough, somehow there is a country that is pushing these issues even further, and as a warning for how bad things could get, has managed to hold on for now. Let's call it Canada with snakes.
Around 200,000 electronic poker machines, known as pokies, fill bars, pubs, clubs and casinos.
Capping losses of $100 a day and $5,000 a year.
Australia was officially the worst on record, with the average property costing 8 times the median household income.
Sydney's rental market has gone from bad to worse, with prices continuing to soar.
Revelations tax payer money is being used.
We are undefeatable!
Every year, up until its downfall, Credit Suisse would prepare a report that looked at how wealthy the people of the countries around the world were. Instead of just looking at GDP per capita, which calculates how much the average person in an economy produces in market output every year, this report attempted to calculate the net worth of those people to see how good they were at accumulating wealth over time. Someone with a high income that is spending everything they make on rent and overpriced food isn't going to grow their wealth as quickly as someone who has a more modest income but is paying off their own home and is investing goods into their retirement accounts. I like to call this the San Fran Tetro conjecture. But according to these annual reports, the Australian people always looked like the second group of slower, more deliberate wealth builders. Their raw income isn't as high as here in America, but they were consistently some of the wealthiest people on the planet. UBS, which acquired Credit Suisse following its collapse, recently released the 2024 report, and once again, Australians had the second highest median net worth on the planet. They only fell behind Luxembourg, which is a European micronation which you are probably not in the tax bracket to even be aware of. The fact that this report tracks the median instead of the average net worth is also really important. This means that the Australian right in the middle of a lineup from the richest to the poorest is more than twice as rich as an American in the same position. The report also includes a generic average where America does have a slight edge. But all that really tells us is that we have an inequality problem with a small group right at the top massively dragging up the average at the expense of everybody else involved. Considering all of this, the title of this video might not make much sense to you. Anybody would be lucky to be Australian, right? Well, yes and no. And lucky really is the important word here. Australia has become so wealthy by getting lucky in just a few key industries, and then by going all in on keeping those industries alive by any means necessary, including its own long-term viability. Of course, the most obvious place where this has happened is in the country's outrageous real estate market, which makes even the most overpriced cities in America look downright affordable by comparison. And of course, we will get to that. But housing is actually only just one symptom of much bigger structural problems that the country has been quietly trying to ignore. There are lots of people that look like they are happily building wealth in Australia, and there are even a lot of people becoming extremely wealthy. But the different ways to actually obtain that wealth are very narrow. The key to Australian wealth is dirt. Either digging it out of the ground to export as unimproved natural resources, or by selling it back and forth to one another. Economic complexity ranks a country's exports based on how varied they are, and how unique they are to that country. A country that exports a wide variety of highly unique products that only it produces would have high economic complexity. A country that only exports a few goods that lots of other countries also export would have low economic complexity. Australia has the lowest economic complexity of any high-income country in the world, ranking 102nd out of 146 total countries included in the survey. That has been falling consistently since the 1950s, when it was in the top 30 thanks to a combination of manufacturing as well as research and development coming out of the country. But today, this puts it behind places like Uganda, which have a more varied export base than Australia. It now depends almost exclusively on selling natural resources and livestock to growing economies in Asia because it just doesn't make financial sense to focus anywhere else. Having such a resource-dependent economy means investors have to decide between funding new innovations that could improve the world, or at the very least provide sustainable cash flows, or they could invest into developing more mines to export more resources to an existing list of willing buyers. The second option has just been a much safer bet for decades, which means that the country has some of the most advanced natural resource extraction in the world, but is severely behind in other areas of innovation like technology and advanced manufacturing. In some tragic irony, the Australian government itself has helped to fund a lot of scientific research resulting in advancements in solar panels, the advent of Wi-Fi, modern medical tools, and even Google Maps. Any of these alone would be a major contributor to the country's relatively small population. But when it came to actually commercializing these technologies, the country lost out because its dependence on natural resources undermined its business environment. Investors would rather the safe, predictable option, and so these technologies naturally moved to where they could find funding from other sources that were willing to take a risk. Unfortunately for Australia, this actually just ended up making their investment markets even more risky. For a long time, the Australian dollar was almost perfectly correlated with natural resource prices, which meant Australian investors were resource investors whether they liked it or not. This price connection has decoupled since COVID, but that itself is probably not a good sign. It could actually be the biggest indication that Australia has dug itself into a hole, both literally and figuratively, that it's going to be almost impossible to get out of without giving up a lot of the wealth it's become accustomed to. So it's time to learn how money works to find out how long Australia can keep getting away with it. This week's video is sponsored by Henson Shaving. Henson is on a mission to revolutionize shaving, creating a skin-friendly experience that eliminates irritation, razor burn, and ingrown hairs. They're challenging the frustrations we've all come to accept, improving there's a better way. Their Henson razor, engineered with aerospace-grade precision in Canada, features recyclable double-edged blades that cost just pennies. Unlike wasteful cartridge razors, it's built for both sustainability and exceptional control, giving you a smooth, irritation-free shave without compromise. I've been using the Henson razor for 5 months, and the difference is unbelievable. Shaving used to be a hassle, constant irritation, bumps, and the never-ending cost of replacement blades. Now my skin feels healthier, and the process is faster, smoother, and way more enjoyable. It's no longer just a task. It's a routine I actually look forward to. What sets Henson apart is their commitment to both your skin and the environment. Their razor helps reduce the billions of plastic disposables that end up in landfills every year, all while delivering a safer, superior shave. Whether you shave daily or just occasionally, this razor completely changes the experience. Say goodbye to irritation and waste, and hello to a healthier, more sustainable shave. Go to hensonshaving.com/HMW and enter code HMW at checkout to get 100 free blades with your purchase of a Henson razor. That's enough refills for 2 years of shaving. There are dozens of serious problems just under the surface in Australia that you might not think of much by themselves, but together they change the optics of the country from a thriving and vibrant economy to a place living on long borrowed time. One of those issues is gambling. Sports gambling, online casinos, and market wagering has become one of the fastest growing industries here in America since regulations were loosened in 2018. Since then, billions of dollars have been piled into carving out market share, encouraging people to bet on basically anything. The rush to acquire customers has become so extreme that a lot of these companies aren't even running their online casinos at a profit because they are reinvesting as much as they can into growing their customer base as fast as possible. The reason why investors don't mind burning billions of dollars in a highly risky industry with serious regulatory risks is because of Australia. Australia is living in the future when it comes to gambling, and that future is bleak. According to their own government inquiries, Australians lose almost $1,000 per person every year through different forms of betting. That's inclusive of a large share of the population who don't partake at all. So the losses of the average Aussie punter are statistically far worse. Australia has a deep, wide, and highly entrenched gaming industry. The average Australian pub operates like a mini casino complete with a small selection of electronic poker machines. Betting on sports is commonplace. Horse racing is a major tradition that even has its own public holiday. Novelty betting markets has been a major thing there for decades, and this is all on top of more traditional gambling like lotteries, casinos, and scratch-offs. Back here in America, the venture capitalists have done the math and have figured out if they can replicate Australian-style gambling in a market as big as ours, then they can stand to make trillions. Australia is also a great business test case against the risk of regulation. Unsurprisingly, the sheer market penetration of gambling in Australia has caused problems for at-risk individuals, largely young men. On top of the financial consequences of losing thousands of dollars every year, the country has an epidemic of related issues like fraud, petty crime, and violence stemming from unhealthy gambling. The public also largely hates how prevalent gambling is pushed on them, so you would expect it would be easy to get the political support to pass laws to moderate the reach of this industry, right? Wrong. All of these companies employ lots of people, and they spend a huge amount of money on fear-mongering the job losses that would come if a local bar couldn't have a casino floor stapled onto it. For any of you who haven't been to Australia, you might think I am joking. I am not joking. Australia has been extremely soft on regulation, and while gambling by itself is not single-handedly going to take down the country, it's emblematic of a lot of genuine issues that aren't getting addressed because nobody wants to be responsible for shaking up the delicate balance of prosperity. The same is true for the mining industry from earlier, and the real estate crisis that we still need to get to. There is nothing wrong with the country exporting its resources. The problem Australia has had is turning a revenue source that is good for Australia into money that is good for Australians. A lot of the revenue generated by mining in Australia has just been paid out to foreign mining companies in arrangements that are not that different from many exploited third-world petrostates. Australia has tried in the past to generate more government revenue from its resources, but heavy lobbying won out, and people have been too afraid to try it again since the currency has been so dependent on these exports. In fact, the government has actually gone the other way and given hundreds of obscure grants, bonuses, deferments, schemes, and incentives to mining companies to help them along. According to the government's own minerals website, the intention of these schemes is for providing both commercial and operational advantages to investors. New government initiatives support the long-term sustainability of the Australian resources sector by de-risking and encouraging mineral exploration and discovery. One of the country's biggest problems is that nobody wanted to invest anywhere else, so this does seem a bit strange. But destabilizing this source of foreign income could knock over other highly leveraged areas of the economy, so the government is trying to keep it running hot by whatever means necessary. Now, at this point you might be thinking, how the heck did this place get so rich to begin with? Was it really just putting a bigger number on their homes and calling that wealth? Well, yes, but there actually is still one more thing. Australia has a system called superannuation, which is a special tax-advantaged investment vehicle that Australian workers can use to save and invest for their retirement. It's functionally similar to a 401k or an IRA, but the big difference is that employers must contribute a share of their employees' pay into their nominated account every year, instead of it being voluntary or offered as a part of their job package. The current contribution requirement is 11.5%, which means every Australian worker is effectively saving more than 10% of their income for retirement. Something like that would make even a lot of disciplined financial planners blush. The hope is that this money will eventually take the strain off the public's funded pensions as the Australian population gets older, and it has built some enormous fortunes. According to JP Morgan, the average Australian household now has the equivalent of almost $250,000 invested in just this one asset class, before including regular savings, investments, or home equity. The fact that it is mandatory and applied to all workers means that the concentration of retirement savings in the hands of already wealthy households isn't as high as it is here in America. This is genuinely an amazing financial tool, and you might be starting to notice a trend here. It has covered over a lot of other problems. Collectively, Australian superannuation is worth more than $2 trillion USD, which is only enough to buy 2/3 of Apple, but it has outgrown the Australian investment market because investment activity is just not as strong there. This means more and more of these retirement savings have been invested abroad, with the majority of that money ending up back here in the American markets. Now, that alone is not a bad way to diversify risk outside of Australia. And yes, it's all getting pumped into the Magnificent Seven, but that's all investing these days. What could possibly go wrong? The real problem is that Australia is technically taking their cash, which is propped up by a mining industry, and then giving it to us so that we can build businesses here in America. A lot of Australian companies, which are not in the gaming, mining, or real estate industry, are actually choosing to raise investments and go public here in America instead. Simply because we have more investors that are willing to put money into companies that aren't in gambling, mining, or real estate. I mean, thanks, I guess. But if the country was more accommodating of other investments, it could use a lot of this savings to make its people and itself wealthier and more productive. The wealth invested into the Australian superannuation system may also be very impressive, but it won't actually do much unless it can keep up with how expensive it is to live in Australia. A common strategy for Australian workers is to wait until they can access their retirement savings, take all of the money they accumulated over their working career, and use it to pay off their house. So yeah, this is where we finally get to the elephant in the room: real estate. The cost of housing in Australia has made every single problem so far even worse, and it's also going to make it much harder to fix. According to a broad market survey, the average age of a first home buyer in Australia is 36 years old, and the fastest growing group of people buying a home for the first time are those aged between 40 and 49. Homes are so expensive that they are usually taken on with a 30-year mortgage, and families will move into larger homes as they build up equity. So a lot of Australians are now getting to the age they would like to retire still in massive debt. Using the proceeds from superannuation to pay off their mortgage doesn't technically make them any poorer. They have just transferred retirement savings into real estate equity. But it does allow them to access the government's public old age pension, since it's not counted as an asset to assess if they have the ability to fund themselves. Since paying a mortgage or rent normally takes up so much of people's budget there, giving up retirement savings often works out to be more financially responsible, because even a modest pension income can cover everything else as long as they have a paid-off house to live in. For many households, this has made one of Australia's greatest wealth-building tools just another way to prop up a real estate market that is already so expensive that the rest of the world should be afraid of it. But how did it get this bad in the first place? There was the usual combination of investor speculation, generous financing, NIMBYism, and high levels of migration into cities that couldn't expand fast enough. But on top of that, Australia has added its own special ingredients. Taxes on earned income in Australia are some of the highest in the world. Someone earning the equivalent of just 120,000 American dollars a year would pay 45% on every additional dollar they earned after that. And remember, Australia is not a cheap place to live. So even though that would be a very good salary for anybody, it's not actually going to go that far after tax is taken out. However, one of the unique features of Australia is the fact that personal investment losses, including paper real estate losses, can be used to write off personal income to reduce their tax. This effectively makes every person in Australia their own little business that can accrue expenses to offset their tax. And the best business to get into with the most possible expenses is real estate. This tax structure has encouraged high-income earners to favor investing in real estate that they can use to make paper losses like depreciation to offset their income, and then turn highly taxed earned income into much more modestly taxed capital gains. The system, called negative gearing, is almost universally agreed to be broken. It would be a lot easier to tax everybody at a lower rate and get rid of these write-offs. But it's been really hard to make that happen because they can't afford this house of cards to unravel. There is now so much debt and wealth tied up in Australian housing that the Australian economy could be wiped out by even the indication that the government could randomly incentives. The same thing is happening with other less obvious policies as well. Immigration to Australia has been some of the most intense in the world. The country has become highly dependent on low-income immigrants to do a lot of the jobs they aren't willing to, and high-income immigrants to also buy into their asset market. According to Henley Partners, a law firm specializing in legal arrangements for high-net-worth immigrants, over 40% of the millionaires in Australia today were not born there. Some have, of course, gone there and made their fortunes, but most have just gone there and parked their fortunes that they already had. In all of the biggest issues in the world today, Australia is a look at what 10 years from now could mean for us. And perhaps the biggest problem is that so far we have managed to keep everything intact. But there is a difference between success and delayed consequences. Australia has some of the most valuable banking institutions in the world, but most of their books are tied up in lending to an overvalued real estate market. Workers are getting taxed heavily while dealing with declining real incomes. Businesses are finding it too expensive to operate there, and all of the wealth in the world, paper or otherwise, doesn't mean anything if it can only buy you a one-bedroom apartment 2 hours from anywhere. Now, if you are an Australian and this was all a bit depressing for you, it could be worse. You could be from the UK. Also, go and watch this video on Canada next to find out how they effectively made exactly the same mistakes as Australia without even accidentally making themselves rich in the process. And make sure to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.
Let's keep fighting until we have a winner. I suck.
Americans are the best consumers on the planet, and it's really not even close. The runner-up is China, and they spend less than a third of what we do in any given year, even though they have almost 5 times as many people. It might not always feel like it, but by global standards, we are incredibly rich. We love buying shit, and we aren't afraid of going into debt to keep doing it. More of our economy depends on the consumption of goods and services than basically any other major country in the world. But this has to have a limit, right? As a direct result of our own insatiable desire to consume, our household savings rates are now the lowest they have ever been, and high-risk, high-interest consumer lending has surpassed $1 trillion. That doesn't include things like car loans, home loans, student loans, medical loans, or informal lending like buy now, pay later, which are also approaching all-time highs. So what is going to happen to the best consumers on the planet if they can't afford to consume anymore? And more importantly, could we solve all of our problems by just buying less shit?
The ocean of debt is getting deeper, but there are indications that some are doing a better job treading water.
It's probably because they're just rejoicing at the fact that they can get a car again. Holy bejeez, I don't know if I can do this, but I need the car.
Amazon, Target, and Walmart are already offering discounts to consumers.
Don't make enough money to meet the minimum cost of living in New York City, and nearly 80% of households are considered housing burden, which means more than 30% of household income is going towards rent.
According to data from the World Bank, America is responsible for about a third of all consumer spending worldwide, even though we only represent 4% of the global population. According to the same report, consumer spending is now 69% of our total economy. For comparison, in the second largest consumer market in the world, China, consumption only accounts for 38% of their GDP. Now, that might be a bit of an unfair comparison. Outside of its major cities, China still has a lot of people who are very poor and don't buy things beyond the bare essentials. The European Union is a more comparable peer, but when counted as a single group, only 51% of their GDP is tied up in consumer spending, and as time goes on, they are spending less and less while we are spending more. By basically any metric, Americans are the best consumers on the planet, and this wasn't by accident. After the Second World War, America had a problem. The industrial juggernaut we had built up to fight the war in Europe and the Pacific no longer needed to make planes, tanks, ships, and munitions for the war effort. After the Great Depression, the government really didn't want to let these factories go idle, so it continued policies first pushed by the New Deal to encourage consumer spending to give those factories and their workers something to feed. The problem suddenly became that the market was saturated with goods and services, and there was presumably a limit to what people would buy. It was at this point that modern Mad Men-style advertising became a thing, as companies now needed to create demand rather than just catering to the demand that already existed. A not-so-fun fact is that a lot of the men that honed their craft creating propaganda for the First and Second World War pivoted to advertising where they could use their skills to sell products instead of selling the nation's war efforts. The historian Kenneth Jackson noted in his book Crabgrass Frontier that the year after the war ended, there were only 8 self-contained shopping centers in America. Most purchases were still done at local standalone stores that catered to the essentials for everyday life. Just 14 years later, though, at the start of the 1960s, there were over 4,000 shopping centers across the country, all vying for those sweet, sweet consumer dollars. At this time, most of the other major economies around the world had the more immediate problem of rebuilding their factories and infrastructure that were destroyed during the war. Only after that did they have to start worrying about what to do with their extra industrial output. This gave America a head start in consumerism that has been hard to catch up to. So that's the incredibly brief story about how we got here. But what does this actually mean for us today? Apart from creating a general culture of consumerism, the undermining of personal financial stability, corporate consolidation, resource depletion, and waste generation, there are 3 less obvious but more immediate problems that consumer-first economic policies have created, and 2 very important reasons why we can't really afford to get off the treadmill of consumption. The first problem we slowly created for ourselves is that consumerism made luxury, convenience, and experience cheap, but everyday life expensive. The optimization of industry, combined with globalized trade, finance, and shared expertise, has made consumer goods incredibly incredibly cheap by historical standards. Adjusted for inflation in the 1960s, an airline ticket from New York to Europe would cost $6,000, a fridge $4,000, a massive 21-inch color TV was almost $9,000, a home microwave oven produced by Raytheon was $5,000, and even modest home furnishings were worth the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today. Added together, these consumer goods and services that probably seem pretty basic to you were collectively worth as much as a house. That's because back then, consumer goods were luxuries, but housing was a pretty basic purchase. Today, global industry has made consumer goods extremely cheap, but constrained resources like land very expensive. You could go on an extended European vacation, buy the latest array of electronics and home appliances, and probably spend less than a few months' rent. All of these goods combined wouldn't add up to a down payment on a home in most cities, let alone an outright purchase. Now, hot take alert, but a lot of this stuff is actually pretty great. Fridges, washing machines, and modern computers do make our lives better and easier. Even modern services like, well, you know, YouTube can be great if consumed in moderation. And I am not just saying that because I am a dirty, stinking, hypocritical creator. Modern conveniences have improved our lives, and if consumerism stopped there, we could probably have found a happy balance between cheap modern amenities without the trade-offs that came with it. But the problem was, it was almost impossible to stop it there. Building an economy on consumers meant we had to keep on consuming. So it's time to learn how money works to find out what happens when we are finally full. This video is sponsored by Grammarly, your AI writing partner that helps you write faster and more effectively with high-quality suggestions. You may know Grammarly as a spelling grammar tool, but it goes way beyond that. It integrates seamlessly with your favorite apps, helping professionals communicate more clearly and confidently, and works where you do. Whether you're drafting emails, writing proposals, or even scripting videos, Grammarly's AI features help you go from draft to done fast. No more endless rewrites or second-guessing your tone. For me, writing professional emails used to take forever, but with Grammarly's AI suggestions, I get real-time feedback that helps me sound polished and professional without the stress. One of my favorite features, Grammarly tailors suggestions based on your audience, because writing to your boss is different from texting a friend. Grammarly is completely free to try. Just sign up and download using my link in the description. It's the easy and trendy thing to write off consumerism as just a generically bad thing. So as much as I would love to make an easy video about how consuming modern goods and services is everything wrong with the world, there is a little bit more to it than that. A lot of things we consume genuinely increase our standard of living and quality of life. Somewhere between you leaving society behind to live off the land and taking out a buy now pay later loan for a Temu order is some happy medium of spending on consumer goods and services. Economists call this simple idea the law of diminishing marginal utility, where as consumption increases, the additional satisfaction and utility gained from each additional unit consumed falls. Normal humans just call it not overdoing things. And the strongest evidence to support the idea that we are overdoing things is that consumption is actually surprisingly equitable. According to data prepared by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the lowest quintile households spent approximately $1.37 trillion on personal consumption in 2022. The top 20% of households, on the other hand, spent just over $6 trillion. This still means that the wealthiest households are spending more than 4 times as much on consumer goods and services as the poorest households. But that's still relatively equal considering that the top 20% of households earn more than 14 times as much. So, what does this tell us? It shows that for most people, there is a basic level of consumption that is needed to live a normal life. And especially here in America, there are certain expenses that are really hard to avoid. According to the report, the biggest cost for most people was, surprisingly, housing. Housing can't be mass-produced in a factory on the other side of the world like most consumer goods, so it's become really expensive. We have already covered that problem. Transport was the other major cost for most households, as in most parts of the country, you need a car to get around, and for low-income households, that is a serious financial commitment. This can also be traced back to the consumer boom of post-war America as lobbying from the automobile industry to build car-friendly cities. And the mass adoption of remote single-family suburban developments meant that most of America was built around the car. The few East Coast cities that are either walkable or have reliable public transportation are unrealistically expensive for low-income households in other ways. So without a lot of sacrifices, most people are forced into owning a car. Personal spending on healthcare is also a uniquely American budget item that pushes up the numbers without really delivering results any different from those godless freedom-hating Europeans. Either way, it's easy to blame consumerism on consumers. But a lot of these expenses are extremely hard to avoid, even if people don't have the money to pay for it. According to the same report, this consumption of the bare essentials meant that the bottom 20% of households were spending $727 more than they made after tax every year. Now, you might be wondering, how can a household spend more money than it makes every single year? The answer is debt, of course, but also the people in the bottom 20% change every year. If someone loses their job and it takes them a while to get work again, they may end up in the bottom 20% temporarily until they find a new job and jump back up to whatever income bracket they were in before. This means that they will go through their savings or rack up debt to keep themselves functioning, but they should be able to recover once they are back on their feet. An inconvenient side effect of this consumer-driven debt is that people in debt also make for better, more motivated workers because they need to work more else. Studies by the National Institute of Health found that workers with high levels of debt were less likely to change jobs, more likely to work unpaid overtime, and less likely to make demands for better pay and benefits. Now, even if you are responsible with your borrowing, it can be really hard to maintain modern living standards as more of what we consume transitions to being subscription-based. Even if you do save diligently for purchases, sometimes it's not even possible to pay up front anymore. So you need a regular income to make sure you can cover next month's round of automated deductions from your bank account, whether it can be from American Express, Netflix, Hulu, Afterpay, your student loans, car loans, AT&T, Adobe Cloud, Microsoft Game Pass, Peloton, or if you are a true power consumer, all of them at once. If you lose your income for any reason, you don't actually own anything to tide you over, so it's a lot easier to fall behind a lot faster. Now, the bad news is that as jobs become less secure, regular layoffs become the corporate norm, and work becomes less formal, most people are going to experience this fun little financial roller coaster at some point in their life career. Data from the Fed showed that at the height of the pandemic-era stimulus, the fastest growing share of retail consumer spending came from low-income earners. This was simply because stimulus checks let them make purchases that they weren't able to afford before. Since then, growth in spending from high-income earners has more than doubled that of low-income earners. Companies have seen pandemic-era wealth accumulation and gone upmarket on most of their items, catering to the group of consumers that still has purchasing power. So if anybody really has the power to stop their consumption, it's high-income earners. And on an individual level, that's probably a really good idea. A report by the Wall Street Journal has found that the U.S. economy as a whole now depends more on the spending habits of the top 10% than ever before, because they are the only ones that can reliably afford high-margin non-essentials. In such a consumer-centric economy, protecting those rich people who are the consumers becomes the most important objective, even though protecting workers would be a better long-term solution because better paid and more productive workers turn into consumers anyway. An alarming amount of extremely high-income earners are living paycheck to paycheck because companies have gotten so good at making sure that there is always something to purchase. Advertising and marketing have grown in line with consumer spending and now, by themselves, represent as much as 5% of GDP. And the formula has been perfected over the decades. So yeah, a pullback in consumption, especially imported low-quality goods, is probably a good idea as an individual. But on a nationwide level, it could get very scary. Our status as the biggest consumer market in the world gives us a lot of advantages. The reason that America has so many of the world's largest companies is because if you can scale a business to address the entire US market, it's already big enough to be globally dominant. And yeah, as dumb as the current trade wars might seem, we do have a lot of negotiating power because everybody wants access to our consumers. The American economy has been growing much faster than most countries in Europe, and even now most countries in Asia. But more of that than ever